In 1917, conscription, forced military enlistment, is known as the issue that tore the nation apart. Now let's go back in time to see the journey to make conscription the law. In 1914, World War I started. Robert Borden made the promise of no conscription since volunteers were plentiful. He was the Prime Minister of Canada from 1911 to 1920 and the Conservative and Union government leader. Nationalistic feelings, as well as the desire for adventure and paying jobs, was sky high amongst most English Canadians for what was expected to be a short war. In contrast, much less French Canadians volunteered because they felt no ties to Britain or France and felt that Canada did not need to be involved in a foreign war. By the end of 1916, the number of recruits had fallen to an extreme low, so the casualties outweighed the number of volunteers. It became clear that enlistment meant a likely death, so young men did not want to volunteer, nor did their families want to let them. In 1917, Robert Borden visited the European battlefields. The immense struggle of the soldiers made Borden more determined to increase Canada's role in the war. He felt conscription was necessary, even if that meant going back on his promise. Conscription was widely supported by the majority of English Canadians who felt loyal to Britain. The majority of French Canadians, farmers, trade unions, non-British immigrants, pacifists, and conscientious objectors had an anti-conscription stand. Others believed Canada had already done its part, but Borden was already set on conscription.
I believe the time has come when the authority of the state should be invoked to provide reinforcements necessary to sustain the gallant men at the front who have held the lines for months, who have proved themselves more than a match for the best troops that the enemy could send against them, and who are fighting in France and Belgium that Canada may live in the future, Borden said.
The Canadian Expeditionary Force was the source of Canada's international pride, and he felt conscription was the best way to sustain the depleted force. On May 25, 1917, Robert Borden proposed a union government to Sir Wilfrid Laurier, the Liberal leader, because he was afraid of losing the general election that December, and he hoped that working with Liberals would calm down Quebec. He promised the Liberals equal seats in the cabinet for their support. Laurier refused and said,
"Is it not true that the main reason advocated for conscription, not so much publicly as privately, not shouted but whispered, is that Quebec must be made to do her part, and French Canadians forced to enlist compulsorily, since they did not enlist voluntarily?"
Laurier secretly believed that joining the coalition would leave French Canada in the control of Quebec nationalists, and he openly believed that conscription would divide French and English Canadians. After lots of hard work on Borden's part, the Military Service Act was made the law on August 29, 1917. The act forced male citizens from 20 to 45 years old to enlist for military service. This was a great victory for the Unionists, but it was just the beginning. Protests and riots ensued in Montreal for 2 days, with the worst yet to come. To ensure conscription lasted, Borden formed a union government in October of 1917 to win the election in December. It was made up of Conservatives, some English-speaking Liberal members, and some independent MPs supporting conscription. Borden's government won the election with a majority of 153 seats, with only 3 seats in Quebec, while Liberals won 82 seats, with 62 seats in Quebec. Call-ups started in January 1918. On March 28, 1918, the arrest of a man without his exemption certificate triggered riots across Quebec City, which is known as the Easter Riots. It lasted until April 1st. 6,000 soldiers were deployed, and the rioters attacked them with gunfire and improvised missiles, such as ice and bricks. The violence that erupted on the streets of Quebec City resulted in 150 casualties, also counting the 4 civilians that were killed when soldiers shot back at armed rioters. Although hundreds of thousands registered for conscription, 93% of them applied for exemption, and 87% of the requests were granted. Many went into hiding. The Military Service Act was not enforced strictly enough, so the results in numbers were not the best. Although conscripts strengthened Canadian troops, the impact on the war was minimal, since the armistice was in 1918, the same year the call-up started, and the 24,132 conscripts that fought in the front lines was much less than the 400,000 volunteers in the war in total. Also, the economic impact was that Canada put themselves in more debt by enlisting more soldiers. Obviously, the social impact is that conscription divided French and English Canadians. The topic of conscription was brought up again in World War II, but much differently and much less divisive. Mackenzie King was the Canadian Prime Minister for many years, including the years of World War II. He delayed conscription for as long as he could and held a publicist to ask Canadians if he could break his promise of no conscription. The vote was in his favor of breaking his promise. He later conscripted 16,000 troops by in the publicist results, the division between French and English Canadians was evident. 72% of French Canadians voted no. The French became obvious minority in politics and population and were left alone in defending their rights. Conscription sparked the separatist movement in the 1960s. Fast forward to today, the divide along language lines is still recognizable. A poll by HuffPost in 2018 showed that 48% of Francophones identify as Quebecois first, or Quebecois only, in comparison to a 2011 poll showing that 60% of the population identify first as Quebecois. The percent has dropped over time, so the lines are starting to blur. However, the division is still maintained, even through political parties existent today, such as Quebec Solidaire and Parti Québécois, that promote Quebec's independence from Canada and Quebec nationalistic feelings. Conscription left a dent in Canadian history.